We got a bump in school facilities funding. We got a one-time bump in district and charter school funding that's going into basic state aid. They were able to repeal results-based funding, which is the opposite of how it should work. It was sending the most resources to the schools that needed them the least. And we saw a small bump in the mandatory annual increase that the state legislature has to provide for inflation. That is now up to 2.9%. However, we also did see some big concessions. Our government had a $2 billion surplus, which is completely gone now. They made no investment into the rainy day fund. We were expecting COVID relief funds to go away too in less than a year. And took no action really whatsoever on universal ESA vouchers. So we do have with us today, as Rachel mentioned, former State Senator Martin Quesada and former State Representative Isela Blanc. So I'd like to hear from the two of you. Compare this to past sessions. How would you categorize last session compared to the sessions that you had under your belt as state lawmakers? Is this a win for K-12, a loss, or somewhere in the middle? What do you think?
Who's going first?
Why don't you go first, as I see Isela is not yet a co-host, so she probably cannot unmute herself.
Yes. I think for me, seeing those small wins that we made, those were significant, but small, but they did come at the expense of a lot of big things that we needed. So I would say in general, we're holding steady, but we're on the precipice. There's a lot of things hanging around out there that need to be addressed. And there's a question about whether there is motivation to address it. You've got kind of the flat tax that's crippling our revenues. Our teacher pay gap is still one of the worst in the U.S. Obviously, the voucher uh, expense is way higher than projected, and even down to Superintendent Horn's culture wars against certain populations in our school districts. And then I think all of that kind of filters down to the results of some of our bonds and overrides that we had. Although most of them passed, I think those margins grew a lot smaller. I know they certainly did in my district, and that causes a lot of concern because what that means is that the messaging out there needs to get stronger from our end.
Isela, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think former Senator Quesada has it right. I'm going to say we're holding steady. Certainly could have been a lot worse if we had Governor Kari Lake. So for that, I'm absolutely grateful that we didn't. However, it could have been better. I do know that Governor House and her team did a phenomenal job with one-time funding on things like district additional assistance. So for that, we're incredibly grateful. But we did give away $1 billion to Republicans.
Yeah. So if you would flip to the next slide, please, Rachel. Both of our guest speakers have alluded to this perfect storm that we have in the making. So not only do we have a runaway universal ESA voucher program that, they projected that would cost the state around $70 million a year, and we were looking at nearly $1 billion with a $200 to $300 million budget shortfall. There's also the $400 million budget shortfall on top of that from the so-called flat tax that former Governor Ducey pushed into law in 2021. And we are feeling those impacts in real time. We are watching income tax collection, watching it hit our budget. We're watching the voucher program blow through its budget already in the first quarter. And we have nowhere to look for solutions other than at ourselves, because we're the first state in the nation to do this to ourselves. We do have a $1.5 billion rainy day fund, but then what do we do? Like there are no funding sources for these extravagant expenditures. I'm going to drop a link here in the chat that if you want to learn a little bit more about the mess that we're in, But the point is that we've run down our state's previously healthy budget with these poor policies, and we're now underwater. Universal ESA vouchers are not going to pay for themselves. That was promised, which, of course, is nonsense. So now we have a financial mess. And this all has to do with the privatization playbook, which is something that, as Rachel said, you're going to hear us talking more about. That privatizers are making it even more their mission to rob funding from public schools and divert that into into private pockets. I'm going to say that again. I'm distracted by watching this adorable monkey stealing the hubcap. Our privatizers are not nearly as adorable, that they are stealing money from public schools and diverting it into private pockets. So the special interests are continuing to push that, and the privatization playbook is to discredit our public schools. They aren't doing the job. They're grooming our children. You'll hear all kinds of nonsense, and then defunding the public schools, whether that is simply not keeping up with inflation or actively taking money away with a variety of policies, and that dismantles our public schools. It's just a lather repeat of attacks. There are some states that are not taking the bait. Texas has had 4 or 5 special sessions where their governor is trying to push vouchers, and Republican lawmakers in rural districts are holding the line very strong because they know that is not good for their communities. Georgia, Idaho, Tennessee are some other states that are holding the line strong against vouchers. Not every state is drinking the Kool-Aid. Representative Blanc, maybe you could go first this time. I'm interested in how you saw this playbook playing out during your terms.
Oh, you guys were all there with me in 2017 when the Republicans dropped a massive universal voucher expansion bill on a Wednesday, and we had to have a debate on it on Thursday. And I'm sure former Senator Quesada remembers how robust that debate was. And I think part of my frustration at that time is that we, in general, to your point, right, you have Texas that is holding out and not voting in favor of privatization because of rural legislators. And it was our rural legislators, exception to one, former state representative Drew John, who ended up, falling for the trap, if you will, thinking that somehow if he had voted yes, he would get the support of Governor Ducey. And what ended up happening is Governor Ducey, in essence, stabbed him in the back, and he did not go back to the Arizona State Legislature. He only served 1 term. All that to say is, we were there with you guys, right? We've been fighting the battle, and in 2022, unfortunately, Governor Ducey, along with the help of now Speaker Toma, was very successful in doing the universal voucher expansion. And I think, it's our rural legislators, right? We're screwed now. I say that with lots of positivity in terms of we can do something about it. It's really going to be difficult to roll back an entitlement. But I think it's going to take time, and we just kind of have to stay committed. And our schools has done a really phenomenal job. It's a long game, right? And there's a lot of private dollars that are working against public schools. But when you talk to people, most people are absolutely unaware that private schools do not have the same level of accountability that public schools have. And it's ongoing education. I mean, you guys know, you've been in the fight. Like, I don't have to rehash it. You guys exist because you started the fight in 2017, thank goodness. And I will leave it to Mr. Quesada, who has been in the fight even longer, right? Having served, what was it, at least 5 terms, Quesada?
Yeah, almost 11 years. Well, Yeah, I guess really I think I want to kind of highlight two things that Representative Blanc mentioned there. She said long game and she said private dollars. And I think that's the key right there. That's what I saw while I was there. And I got to give them and the proponents of this measure, which is the extreme right wing. I got to give them credit for their strategy because their strategy is a long credit because they've been brilliant at being that. And so when I say that, it's a lot like they've done with a lot of other issues in Arizona. It's a long-term agenda. If they're playing that long game and they're investing in it, just like they are stacking our judicial branch, just like they are suppressing our vote, just like the institutions of structural racism, just like the defunding of public education. It falls in line with that long-term agenda. And it's a long-term agenda, and it's being fed by talking points and by false fear tactics that are being used. And the superintendent Horn is doing that right in front of our eyes right now. They're scaring people, but that messaging is sinking in to the public. And the hope is that 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 years down the line, this is going to pay off big, and we're already seeing it paying off big for them now. So I've seen this be a long-term agenda from the very first day I stepped into the legislature up until now, and I've been out for a while now, and it's still going, and it's still a long-term agenda, and they're still committed to it as a strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to highlight one thing that Representative Blanc said about how it's difficult to take away an entitlement program. Um, that is happening. That just happened in Illinois. Legislators chose to sunset the voucher program there, and it was hard for them. There were some feelings about doing that, but they knew ultimately that um, all the things that we know are wrong with vouchers, the academic impacts, the discriminatory impacts, the financial impacts. I could go on all day just on that. And they looked at it and they sunsetted the program. So we can look to Illinois as well as a state that's holding strong. So looking at the next slide, this meme, you'll have to forgive me. I get my humor can be somewhat black, but the legislature has really become extreme. And I mean, those of you who have not been around in this fight for too long, one of the takeaways that I want you to take from this is, you need to understand it didn't used to be this bad. The two-party system, the gerrymandered safe districts, low turnout closed primaries where only the most extreme people vote, low information general voters, the rise of disinformation. There are so many reasons that have factored in together to create this mess. But what we see now is just a complete dearth of so-called moderates, and the ones that are left generally follow one of two models. They either move to the right to avoid being primaried and losing their primaries. And it's my opinion that we're seeing folks like Matt Gress falling in that mold, or they simply walk away, give up in frustration. And that most recently has been Steve Kaiser, but Boyer, folks going back, that's sort of, the one of the two options is run to the right or lose your seat or leave. Senator Quesada, Representative Blanc, how has the legislature changed from when you were first in office to when you left? And even now, Representative Blanc, you mentioned Drew John. The more modern example of that would be Joel John. I believe they're related. But he was the one who took that bait and lost his seat for it in 2022.
I am going to let Senator Quesada lead on this question because he has a wealth of knowledge and information and can really speak to how much the legislature has changed. I mean, having served, again, 11 years, which has been phenomenal.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think the slide kind of sums it up. There are no moderate R's anymore. And what I've noticed is the last couple of years that I've been involved, the ones that we call moderate aren't really moderate. I mean, they would have been radically extreme back when I first started. They would radically far right wing Republicans back in 2012 when I first got into the legislature. That's how they would have been considered then. But now they are considered moderates. And so it's definitely been polarized. It's definitely been radicalized. But one thing that I want to point out, and I think it's important, that we as a community we fail to recognize it and we fail to respond accordingly, because I think too many, and I hear it all the time, every conference I go to, almost every political leader I listen to, on both sides of the aisle, they fall into that trap of saying that there's extremism on both sides. And I want to ask, is there really extremism on both sides? Because please compare the extreme proposals from the left to the extreme proposals on the right and tell me that those are equally extreme. And that is also part of a long-term agenda that we talked about before, to make the left appear as radical as the right. And that makes the entire debate shift to the right. And so what we have now is the center of our political debate here in Arizona is really pushed to the far right. And the center is now the right. And what used to be the center a long time ago is now considered radical left, because people on both sides of the aisle are calling both sides equally extreme. And I don't think that's the case at all.
Yeah, I want to add to that. Thank you so much, Senator Quesada. That's true. It is maddening every time I would hear that, the Arizona State Legislature has both extremes. Not true. I think a lot of our former colleagues and new Democratic colleagues are probably a little bit more moderate. And at the end of the day, I think Democrats at the state legislature are really focused in doing what is best for the state of Arizona. And then also, believe it or not, they want to be fiscally responsible as well. And too often, I know when I served, and I'm sure Senator Quesada can speak to this, it was unfortunately the far right that was, and really the Republicans that were not being fiscally responsible. And we can point to the growing 700 million voucher problem, where there's no money coming in to take care of that program, and they don't have a solution, right? Like somehow there's just magical money that's going to appear, and we know it's not, right? And so I think our challenge as folks that don't want to see the Arizona State Legislature continue to go even farther to the extreme is how and when are Democrats going to start being more aggressive on messaging in terms of letting Arizonans know that it has been the right side of the aisle that has allowed the Arizona to just kind of $9.5 billion. This last legislative session, in 7 years, it grew to over $18 billion. And that was because of federal funds that the federal government gave to the state. But I just want to highlight that the Democrats are not extreme. They just authentically care about Arizona and doing the right thing and making those investments. And it's the fringe right that is, a lot of them aren't even from Arizona.
One thing that we should also highlight is the razor thin margins of power. So this is the fourth year in a row with these partisan splits of just one seat in each chamber. And despite this razor thin margin of power, legislative Republicans are governing as unilaterally as they can. And this past session, it's my opinion that only having a Democratic governor was holding them back. But we are on the precipice of real change. I personally am focused on the election, which is just 11 months away. And we've been on the precipice of real change for so long. I really feel like the more and more radical that the extreme right gets, the more extreme that they get, the more people hear about it, the more voters will be making different choices. And I'm convinced that we will see that in 2024. So what, speaking of 2024, can we expect? I mentioned it earlier, the AEL, the school spending cap, is already off the table for 2024, which is wonderful. We don't have to worry about that in 24. And I would argue that we are not going to get this radicalized legislature to address the situation long-term in 2024. So from Save Our Schools perspective, that is tabled. We do expect to see lots more culture war bills, pronouns, bathrooms, book bans, you name it. The Republicans see Hobbs' vetoes as proof of her being out of touch. They apparently don't own any mirrors, and they will likely double down. John Kavanaugh has said that he is going to intro some of the very same bills again with just small modifications to make them, and I quote, possibly more acceptable. We do expect to see lots more teacher attacks, curriculum restrictions, lesson plan posting mandates, all the same ideas that were vetoed last session. One that I really want to talk about is the wolves in sheep's clothing. So some of our pro-privatization lawmakers are a little more savvy, and they are trying to appeal to low information voters with by talking about concepts with broad support, like raising teacher pay, addressing the teacher retention crisis by funding training programs. The Prop 301 renewal that they're talking about right now is a prime example of this. Teacher pay sounds great as a headline until you dig deeper and realize that not only does this proposal that they've put forward not work, it was never intended to work. So, we really got to watch out and talk to people about these wolves in sheep's clothing. Ballot referrals, that sort of the same, teacher pay raise, Prop 301 renewal concept, but going around the governor's veto pen. And the key here is that they need the electorate's approval. They need to hoodwink low information voters into supporting their schemes in order to make this strategy work. So again, that's a place where we can have an impact by talking to people and helping them understand not to drink the Kool-Aid. But I really do think anything goes from this legislature. We are going to see lots of extreme ideas. We've already seen school takeover bills and proposals to push guns onto school grounds. I don't know. We're going to see even more of that. But we, as Save Our Schools Arizona, are here to talk about vouchers. And we do have universal vouchers now in Arizona, but there's always further that the privatizers can push. So fundamentally, the strategy is greed, power, and control. They are going to look to, I predict they're going to look to strengthen and expand universal ESA vouchers. You're going to see pushes to expand allowable goods and services. We have already seen on the administrative end, the Arizona Department of Education just basically rubber stamping any expense, to where we wind up with $10,000 sewing machines, ski trips in 8 states, KitchenAid mixers, and again, a list as long as my arm. But we've seen also it was labeled the Have Your Cake and Eat It Too bill, the interscholastic activities bill that would have forced public schools to allow voucher students to try out for sports teams at public schools, which is ludicrous. You left public school, you don't get to now go back and cherry pick and drain funds from that local public school. But I predict that we will see that again. We did see multiple STO voucher expansion attempts last session. I predict that those will come back. But the key difference with all of this is that there's no money. They wasted all the money. So it's going to be, I think, very, very hard to sell these programs, because the question that is going to be on the tip of everybody's tongue is, well, how are you going to pay for that? There's no money to pay for that. But they will never stop. So that means that we also cannot stop. We have to stay engaged and we have to keep fighting for our public schools. So we cannot completely reverse the damage in 2024, far from it. All the damage has occurred over time and it's going to take time to fix. We got here incrementally. We need to get out of it incrementally. It's still very important to use our voices and advocate. I personally, Rachel, if you want to move to the next slide, this cartoon is sort of perfect. You know, we're looking at mitigating the damage in 2024, balancing our expectations, and, you know, keep your eye on the real prize of working together in the legislature. There are some good conversations happening as well, which, you know, given the fact that we have such an extreme legislature, might surprise some of you. But I've heard multiple conversations happening around the teacher retention crisis. And so Governor Hobbs's educator retention task force put out a list of recommendations. You see some of those here on this slide. Senator Bennett was very vocal with the press that he's on board with those. So that gives me hope. He's also talked publicly about lessening some assessment burdens on districts. And he used the example, which I myself have used, like the regulatory burden on public schools is up here. And charter schools, it's here. And, you know, ESA vouchers, it's like down here somewhere, you can't even see it. And, you know, we don't need to, we could, you know, we could bring accountability for ESA vouchers up and maybe lessening some burdens on the districts. So that gives me hope that maybe something good will happen in 2024. But your key takeaways, you know, reminder that we have a goalie in Katie Hobbs. We don't have to agonize over every horrible idea that they throw at us. You know, stay engaged, share our weekly, share our social media posts, share the news reports that we share, be prepared to take action, ask lots of questions. And like I said, how are you going to pay for it is my number one question, but also encouraging our allies to speak up and be bold. They need to know that we are behind them. They can be bold, like Tennessee has been bold, like Illinois has been bold. They have that power. They can act. And keep your eyes on November. You know, we are going to work our butts off to elect pro-public education candidates, just every area of the ballot that we absolutely can. So Senator Quesada, Representative Blanc, what recommendations do you have for our volunteers for public school advocates as we head into the 2024 session?
I would just say, keep holding people accountable, keep holding your elected officials accountable, and that means doing everything that you just mentioned, Melinda. Especially in November, you want to keep them accountable, but at the same time, you want to back them up when they need it. And there's a few that may need that support, that public support, and we got to be willing to support them on whatever side of the aisle they are. If there are good moderate Republicans that need that backing and they're willing to support us, let's give it to them, you know, and because that's what we need. But at the end of the day, it's just it is holding people accountable. It's not just voting you know, for someone because you like their personality. It's voting for them because they're voting for the right public policies. And that can be a hard thing to do sometimes, I know. But that's it at the end of the day, just hold them accountable.
I think my recommendation is, I think public schools, because of COVID and this ongoing attacks from the far right and Moms for Liberty and all those, really far extreme groups that have just done, just a really good job in demonizing public schools and our educators across the board. I think, for you guys that are out there who are parents who have your kids in the public schools, it's getting back to the basics, right? And talking to the people that, that you share a classroom with, right? That your kids share a classroom with on the football field or baseball field or basketball field. And just kind of remind, that this is, right? Taxes, investment. It's investment in our future communities and our long-term sustainability on the economic, a good education system what means that we're going to have, a better society. And just kind of getting back to the basics, I think it seems really simple, but especially to anyone who has families and friends in rural Arizona, I think there's so much power that you guys can leverage, because a lot of these public schools in rural Arizona are in fact some of the top job creators outside of the state and federal government, and really kind of starting to build like coalitions around that, and then pushing and putting pressure on those rural legislators, because it is those communities that are not benefiting from the public school system. And at the end of the day, if you break down, and it is our rural public schools that are really struggling, and if we continue on this road of not investing, those communities are going to suffer the most, because public schools are the hubs of those communities. So for me, it's just, let's get back to the basics, I think. And I think indirectly that does hold elected officials and legislators accountable.
Yes, for sure. And, we as public school advocates, we are not going to go quietly. And we are going to hold lawmakers of all stripes accountable. So that is definitely something that we all can do. Something else that we can do, we can express gratitude. When you are talking to your child's teacher, you can just say thank you to the staff, to the parent volunteers, to each other. And make sure to fill your own cups. Take time off. Next session is probably going to be brutal, and we need to make sure that we are going to be able to be there to fight. So, use the next few weeks to fill your cups so that we can jump back in with renewed vigor in January.